In this week's video, we're going to be discussing Fujifilm's standard zoom, the XF 16-55mm f2.8. Hi everyone and welcome back to the channel. This is Dylan Golby. In this week's video I'm going to be discussing my thoughts on the XF 16-55mm f2.8 for the Fujifilm X series. Now this is in response to a viewer who asked, can we get your thoughts on this? And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of how I use this lens, what I use it for, what I don't use it for. And so we already know from the plethora of reviews that are out there that this is a sharp lens, it is a constant aperture zoom, it is a workhorse of a lens. And that for me is where it fits into my kit. It is a workhorse of a lens. It covers some very useful focal lengths, it has a constant aperture, it does its job, it gets out of the way, but for me it's not a particularly inspiring lens, and so I prefer often to work with fast primes when I can. So what do I mean by an inspiring lens? Well, what I mean by that is basically a lens that makes you want to play to its strengths and make photographs. Now, if you look at my review of Laowa's 33mm f0.95, for example, you'll see a few good examples of this. If you look at the review that I made of the GF 110mm f2, or perhaps if you go all the way back to the beginnings of this channel and take a look at my review of the Laowa 9mm f2.8, you'll get to see what I mean by, an inspiring and interesting lens. So just to use those three examples to get us started, the Laowa 9mm, or for that matter, say the 10-24mm from Fujifilm, are extremely wide-angle lenses, and they get to, I guess they show you the world in a different way, in a way that you normally wouldn't see it, and it can be inspiring to look for subjects that will work for that. Then there are lenses like the one I just mentioned, Laowa's 33mm f0.95, or for example, the lens that I'm shooting on now, Fujifilm's XF 35mm f1.4. Now, those focal lengths can be found within the range of that zoom lens, but the zoom lens has a constant aperture of f2.8, whereas these have much wider apertures and allow for much better subject separation at the same distances. Also, in the case of Laowa's 33mm, if you look at my review, there's some really interesting rendering that you can get from that lens that you just won't be able to get from the zoom lens. So onto the 16-55mm zoom. It covers a really useful range of focal lengths from slightly wide to slightly telephoto. It has good sharpness, good contrast, very little vignetting, especially when you pair it with the software trickery that Fujifilm does in the cameras. And it has some of the fastest autofocus of any of the Fujifilm lenses. But for me, it's just a little bit utilitarian. And that's not to say that you can't make beautiful photographs with it. Beautiful photographs come from things like light, the photographer, composition, the subject matter. They don't really come from lenses. However, I don't ever find myself wanting to take this lens out and make photographs. So why do I own it? I originally invested in this lens because I had a 3-day assignment with the Canadian government. They were sending a delegation over to Korea, and I would need to basically follow that delegation and make photographs for 3 full days. And that would be everything ranging from, meet and greets, to round tables, to portraits, to group shots, to action shots, and all of the things in between those. And it just wouldn't have been practical for me to work my usual way and be changing prime lenses in between that. And I knew that I'd be shooting during the day in fairly well lit locations, so the f2.8 aperture really wouldn't be an issue in that case. So what I decided to do for that particular job was to take the 10-24, the 16-55, and the 50-140mm, and that would basically cover absolutely everything, and the 2.8 aperture wouldn't be an issue. So it would be the best solution for that type of work. So my primary use for this lens is fast-moving government and corporate events in good light, or ones where I can make my own light, such as something like a photo wall or a group shot where I can use a flash and just pump in a little bit of extra light. Now, if it's going to be a really dark situation, chances are I'm going to hang a body off each shoulder, one with, say, a 23mm f1.4 and one with a 56mm f1.2. But if I have to move really quickly and I don't have to worry too much about low light, this is a really good solution for me. The next time that I'll make use of this lens is on something like a travel editorial assignment. Now, For example, a couple of years back, I was sent down to the Jeollanam-do province of Korea to basically photograph the bike paths and a culinary tour of the area. And so what I knew was that I was going to be doing, these sort of scenic vistas, and I was going to be shooting during the day, and I wouldn't really need any shallow depth of field work. So, when you're shooting at f8, it doesn't really matter what lens you've got as long as the focal length works for you. And so what I did was I took this and I took my 50 to 140 millimeter again, and again the 10 to 24. And that allows me to basically have a light kit, which means I'm not being bogged down and I can do a lot more photography with these lenses when I don't need that shallow depth of field. Since both of these job types often take me out of the city and into the countryside of Korea, a lot of my personal travel work is also done with the zoom lens. And for example, a couple of years back, I was down in Vietnam working for a client, and I would be doing a multi-city travel assignment. And at the end of that, I was going to be running a workshop with my good friends at Pics of Asia. And so for that, I also decided to just use the 16 to 55 millimeter and see how it would work. Now, we'd be in the ocean for the morning of shooting that day, and so I thought, well, it's a weather-sealed lens, and I've got a weather-sealed body, so that's just one more little peace of mind while I'm bouncing around in the ocean. So as you might have noticed, the biggest couple of hang-ups that I have with this lens are the fact that it is a 2.8 aperture, a little bit slower than some of the fast primes, and also that its rendering isn't particularly interesting. It's very clinical. And so when it comes to my personal work, I'm often trying to maybe create something a little bit more interesting with shallow depth of field or the specific rendering of a lens that I'm using. And I'm also often trying to challenge myself. So I'll just take one lens with me. And when it comes to a client shoot, you want to be able to create everything they've asked you to do. But when it comes to a personal shoot, you can take just your 23mm f1.4 and play all day. It doesn't matter whether you come back with that specific shot or not. Nobody's judging you on that. It's a way to experiment. And so that constraint of just having one focal length, for example, when I take out the X100V, just having the 23mm is a really, really good way to be able to challenge yourself and try to make various different frames with just a single focal length. However, there are a couple of types of work that I actually avoid the 16 to 55mm for as well, and those are my family sessions and my couple sessions. Now, typically with those sessions, I have a little bit more time to work. I'm not reacting to so many moments as I am sort of creating them for my clients, and so I'm able to work with a single lens for much longer, a single focal length for much longer. The other thing that I do want to get at those sessions is a lot of sort of separation and depth. So shooting wide open is something that I'll do quite frequently at those types of sessions. So for me, when it comes to a family session or a couple session, being able to shoot at f1.2 or f1.4 and really separate my subjects from their backgrounds is much, much more important than the versatility of being able to switch focal lengths really quickly. For the type of work that I do, the 16 to 55mm f2.8 is an absolute necessity at times. However, given the opportunity to work a little bit slower, take my time with things, I much prefer working with prime lenses for the versatility that they offer in terms of extreme shallow depth of field and also those interesting renderings that you get from a lot of prime lenses. Now, once you stop lenses down to f5.6, if you take the 16 to 55, put it at 35mm, stop it down to f5.6, take the current lens that I'm using, the XF 35mm 1.4, stop that down to 5.6. There's going to be very little difference. So if you're planning to shoot at those types of apertures, then the primes don't really make any sense unless you want lightweight. However, this XF 16 to 55 gets the job done in a lot of situations for a lot of people. It gives up a little bit of character for that. It becomes a little bit more clinical, but if that's not the sort of thing that you're worried about, so if you're interested in things like, composition and deeper depth of field and things like that, then the interesting rendering of the primes may be completely meaningless to you, and this will be a really, really good solution. However, for me, this is a lens that I use when I have to, and I don't use when I have the choice to use other lenses. So I hope that that discussion of what this lens is for me, what sort of situations I use it in, what situations I don't use it in, has been helpful, useful, or interesting to you. How do you like to work? Do you like to work with zoom lenses, prime lenses, a mixture of both? What is it that makes you choose one lens over another? Let me know in the comments below. Also, if you have any questions about this lens specifically, please do let me know in the comments below. Thanks again for watching. I hope that it's been at least interesting for you. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers!